Hello everyone, welcome to this French speaking session, or actually this speed French speaking session. So if you are tired of just knowing French rules, but not being able to use them in real conversations, you are at the right place. This video is for you. Because today, you're going to learn how to use on the spot the words for about in French. So, de and à in to talk about and to think about. And without hesitation, because I know that this kind of hesitation is exhausting. And many French learners, when they keep on freezing in their French sentences, usually they often end up thinking things like, maybe I'm not a language person, maybe I'm bad at languages, which is not true. The problem is not you, the problem is your method. You see, when your head is just full of French words or French rules, but you have not been trained to use them in real conversations, at the speed of a real conversation, it's normal to freeze. That's completely logical. And again, it's not your fault. It's just the fault of methods that treat French like a library of information and not as a practical skill. And now we're going to fix this. We're going to build a new automatic reflex. So we're not going to analyze a grammar chart. Here we're going to do a speed practice with to talk about and to think about. So actually a progressive speed practice that will build your muscle memory. So by the end of this video, if you do the whole video, if you focus and you try to make all the sentences in French, you won't be translating about anymore. You'll be automatically choosing the correct French structure clearly and confidently. So let's do it. So we're going to do a speed training. What does it mean? First, I'm going to remind you the basis to say about in French with to talk about and to think about. And then I'm going to say series of very short sentences in English. So some sentences with the verb for to talk about and some sentences with to think about. And after each sentence that I say in English, you have to say this exact sentence in French. Then I say the sentence in French so that you have a direct correction. And then we do the next one. I say the next sentence in English that you say in French, etc. So you'd have to say sentences in French with to think about and to talk about one by one. But of course, first, we start with a warm-up. So you'll be able to do the series quickly. And then by doing this series, you're going to reinforce your reflex in spoken French. So let's start the warm-up. First, you're going to say, I talk about Florent. So with the French first name, Florent, which is a French first name for men, and you're going to say, I talk about Florent. So in this case, what's really important to know is that the about is de. When you use the verb to talk, the about that goes with to talk about is de. So now that you know that, can you say, I talk about Florent? Je parle de Florent. And that's it. That's just that. So you're going to practice very short sentences, but with the about in French. So here with to talk, the about is de, so you say, je parle de Florent. Let's do another one. Can you say, you talk about Florent? With the formal you. So how do you say, you formal talk about Florent? Vous parlez de Florent. So same principle, there's no trap. You see that it's the same words order in English and in French. So here in the whole video, you don't have to worry about the words order. So here you say, vous parlez de Florent. But now let's say you think about Florent. So now with the verb for to think, the about in French is changing. To say about with the verb for to think, you say à. So that's the way it is. About with to think in French is à. So now can you say, you formal think about Florent. Vous pensez à Florent. And that's it. So we're going to play with that. With the about with to think, that is à, and with the about with to talk, that is de. So that's why you really have to focus on what you have to say. So here with to think, it's à. So vous pensez à Florent. Now let's say you think about that. So there are several ways of saying that in French. Here, the that at the end of a sentence or the block of a sentence, this that is ça. So that's the that contains a whole idea, a whole fact. Here we don't have a context, so we don't know exactly what it is. But maybe in the conversation earlier you said, I think that he is coming. Or I think that the weather will be nice tomorrow. That's a whole fact that you don't repeat in the conversation. When everybody knows what you're talking about, you can just say that. And this that in French is ça. So here anyway, in this video, anytime I say that, this that is ça. So can you say, you formal think about that. Vous pensez à ça. And that's it. That's logical. That's still the same principle, but you need to focus on the verb to think and then about with to think, that is à. So vous pensez à ça. But now let's say they talk about that. So when they represents women. So I'm going to say they women talk about that. So how do you say it? How do you say they women talk about that? Elles parlent de ça. And here we have about that goes with to talk. So the about turns into de. So, elles parlent de ça. So now we're going to do our first series. I'm going to say these kind of sentences that we just did in a row. After each sentence in English, you say it in French. I say the translation in French as well. And then we do the next one, etc. So some sentences with the verb to think about and others with to talk about. And we change the pronouns. So it can be I, you formal, you informal, they women, they men, etc. Sometimes you can say oui. To say oui in spoken French, we say on. So anytime I say oui, you say on. And really focus on what you have to say about in French. So get ready. 3, 2, 1. How do you say? They women talk about that. Elle parle de ça. You informal talk about Florent. Tu parles de Florent. I think about Florent. Je pense à Florent. He thinks about that. Il pense à ça. He talks about Florent. Il parle de Florent. We talk about that. On parle de ça. They men think about that. Il pense à ça. She talks about Florent. Elle parle de Florent. You plural think about that. Vous pensez à ça. She thinks about Florent. Elle pense à Florent. And that's it. So congratulations, you did it. That's the first step. So I'll let you take your breath. And you see that when you focus on a grammar theme like this one, and you practice it this way, that's the perfect way to master it. Because you focus on one theme and at the same time, the sentences are a bit different. So you get used to adapt to the sentence, to the new sentences. And as you have to think, that's how you learn. That's how it sticks in your brain. So then it becomes really easier to say it in conversations. So now we're going to do another series. Actually, we're going to do the same series, but with a shorter timer. So now we're going to reinforce your reflexes with to think about and to talk about. So that's the same principle, but really always focus on what you have to say. That's really the most important. If you want to master French speaking, really focus on what you want to say. So this is the same series, but with a shorter timer. So get ready. 3, 2, 1. How do you say? They women talk about that. Elle parle de ça. You informal talk about Florent. Tu parles de Florent. I think about Florent. Je pense à Florent. He thinks about that. Il pense à ça. He talks about Florent. Il parle de Florent. We talk about that. On parle de ça. They men think about that. Il pense à ça. She talks about Florent. Elle parle de Florent. You plural think about that. Vous pensez à ça. She thinks about Florent. Elle pense à Florent. And that's it. So again, congratulations. Now you know a bit better this to think about and to talk about. And you see that this kind of practice really allows you to do your own sentences then in French conversations. Because here I'm saying the sentences in English. But then in real life, it's going to be your sentences. The sentences that you want to say. That you have to say in French. But as right now you are getting used to think of what you want to say, then it's really much easier to say your own sentences in French. So we're going to do another series now, but this one, a series that is a bit more challenging. But first, let's warm up. So let's say the sentence, I talk about Florent. So let's start very simply. How do you say just, I talk about Florent? Je parle de Florent. So here there is no surprise. With to talk, we have de to say about. So, je parle de Florent. Now let's say the same sentence, but in the negative form. So let's say, I don't talk about Florent. So as a reminder, to say the negative form in spoken French, you say pas. And you place the pas just after the first verb. So here in this video, there's only one verb by sentence. So you place the pas just after the verb. And that's it. There is no ne in spoken French. So how do you say, I don't talk about Florent? Je parle pas de Florent. And that's it. Anyway, the about is already the same with to talk. About with to talk is de. So, je parle pas. The pas goes just after the first verb. So first pas and then de. Je parle pas de Florent. Now can you say, you don't think about Florent? So really focus on what you have to say. It's still the same principle. And you're going to say this sentence with the formal you. So how do you say, you formal don't think about Florent? Vous pensez pas à Florent. And that's it. There's the same principle. We have a negative sentence. So with pas just after the verb, just after penser, vous pensez pas. And then we have the about, but the about that goes with to think. So, à. Vous pensez pas à Florent. Now, can you say, why do you think about that? So let's ask questions with why. So first, how do you say why in French? Just why. Pourquoi? So can you say, why do you formal think about that? Pourquoi vous pensez à ça? So here we ask questions in spoken French, and there are several ways of asking questions in spoken French. Here we take the most simple and the most common. So we say the question word first, why, so pourquoi, and then the casual statement. So you think about that. So vous pensez à ça. Pourquoi vous pensez à ça? And that's it. You never invert the subject and the verb in spoken French. So just pourquoi vous pensez à ça? And now can you ask, why does she talk about that? Pourquoi elle parle de ça? So here we have a question with why. So you say first pourquoi, and then she talks about that. And with the about, that goes with to talk this time. So this about is de. Elle parle de ça. So pourquoi elle parle de ça? So let's do this next series now with the sentence that we just did. So with a mix of casual sentences, sentences in the negative form, and questions with why. So get ready. 3, 2, 1. How do you say? They women talk about that. Elle parle de ça. Why do you informal talk about Florent? Pourquoi tu parles de Florent? I don't think about Florent. Je pense pas à Florent. He doesn't think about that. Il pense pas à ça. He talks about Florent. Il parle de Florent. We don't talk about that. On parle pas de ça. Why do they men think about that? Pourquoi ils pensent à ça? She talks about Florent. Elle parle de Florent. Why do you plural think about that? Pourquoi vous pensez à ça? She doesn't think about Florent. Elle pense pas à Florent. And that's it. And again, congratulations, you just made a great step forward in your French speaking. You see, this kind of practice is a part of a full method that gets you to speak French with confidence. That's really the goal of this method. A method that gets you to make your own sentences in French with confidence. And you see that speaking is not the result of learning. Speaking is the way you learn, but through a conscious speaking, a conscious practice. So here you're not shadowing, you're not repeating any sentence, because what's really important to be able to speak French in real conversation is that you really think of what you have to say. That's really the most important. That's what I teach. I teach this philosophy in my speaking method. And if you're interested, I'm giving you access to my free masterclass when you can experience this speaking method. So we don't memorize lists or sentences, but we practice French cleverly and strategically. So in this free masterclass, you will start forming sentences in French from the first module, and you will build the mental reflexes that you need for real French conversations. So if you want to stop memorizing, and if you want to start thinking in French and really speak French with confidence, you can click the first link in the description to get instant access to my free masterclass, and I see you there.